Well, welcome this evening, folks who follow this Bible study online on Facebook Live. And tonight we're talking about Genesis chapters 24 through 27, which is basically the stories of Isaac, although, as we discovered through our reading, Isaac isn't really featured that prominently in Isaac's own story, and so across the field to meet Rebekah. We see that in chapter 25, Isaac is barely mentioned. So it mostly serves as a bridge between Abraham and Isaac's son Jacob. In chapter 27, the final chapter we've read, is mostly about Jacob and Esau and their relationship, although Isaac is featured in that as well, but more as a small supporting actor. Really, Isaac's only chapter is 26, and in that chapter he just does things his father Abraham already did: tell people that his wife is a sister, and make a treaty after a land dispute. What we also have noticed in the chapters today is the family dynamics so far in Genesis have been strange. So in this story, we have parents who pick favorites. Abraham sends Ishmael away. He has extra sons. None of them inherit anything after he dies. Jacob tricks and schemes his brother. Esau marries a woman from another tribe without consulting his parents, which they consider very disrespectful. And so far in Genesis, we've recognized that the family dynamics are not really what we might expect to find in the Bible. So, starting with Adam, who sells out his wife after she eats from the fruit, and Cain, who kills his brother, and Noah curses his son, and Sarah kicks out Abraham's first child out into the wilderness. Men sleep with their maids. Lot impregnates his daughters. Rebekah helps Jacob cheat her own son. Jacob will have 2 wives and 2 concubines in our next story, and all 4 bear children. To him, we've seen incest, polygamy, rape, favoritism, murder, lies, deceit. And these are the family stories of biblical heroes. It's a little hard to get your head around that a little bit, I think, especially when we so often hear the phrase biblical family values. Well, so far in Genesis, through the first 27 chapters, the biblical family values we're actually seeing in the Bible are not exactly what we might want to emulate. And so right now in small groups from which we're about to break, folks have been talking a little bit about what are the biblical family values that we've experienced so far in Genesis. And I think they're having some fun with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit more about Isaac and his children, who are featured prominently in our chapters that we're reading today. All right. Well, I hope you had some interesting conversations. We'll have some more small group time later on tonight. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about as we continue our conversation this evening about the chapters that you read this week is the style of the stories that we've seen in Genesis, the style of the narrative. Now, you've likely noticed in the texts you read this week that there is some repetition. Did anybody notice that? There's a little bit of repetition in the stories? Yeah? Okay, good. Well, in the story of Abraham's servant finding Isaac, his bride, who's Rebekah, chapter 24, that is a repetitive story. The servant tells the entire story to seemingly every person he encounters. Everything, they have a party, and he just says, we should stop. Let me tell you how this all went down. Every single time. So for each person who heard his story, I guess it was new, and they might have thought that was really exciting. For the reader, we keep hearing it over and over again. His servant keeps telling us. There's a lot of repetition in the one story. And also, in a similar vein, we're given stories that are variations on a theme. So, for example, Isaac. He tells a foreign leader that his wife is his sister. We've seen that story. This is the third time in not very many chapters. Also, we have stories of land disputes that end in a treaty. We've seen that too. We've read that story as well. A patriarch's wife who cannot get pregnant. We've seen that story before. And in fact, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but we're going to see it again. It's coming again. That's what we're going to talk about. So this has been happening in Genesis since the very beginning. Quite literally in this case. In the very first creation story, the narrator repeats, "It was good, and it was good, and it was good," like a refrain. There's a lot of repetition in the book of Genesis. And honestly, there will be throughout our entire study of the Torah. The plagues in the book of Exodus are going to be a good example. They have this repetition to them in the storytelling. So why? Mary asked why. I was going to say that anyway, but it was a good prompt. Well, it's important to remember that these stories, one, remained oral traditions for centuries. Storytellers, the people who would share the stories, they had to remember them. They couldn't read them. They had to remember the stories. And then they would tell the stories. And a faithful and accurate retelling of the stories is the only way we get them. Because they were told over centuries and over centuries, the same stories over and over again. The audience, they were not made up of readers. The audiences then were not made up of folks who read like today. So the audience of Genesis today is mostly people who read. You read it at your home by yourself. Somebody reads it to you out loud. But more often, you're reading it privately. That was not the case for listeners, the original listeners. And so the repetition helped the original audience internalize and remember the stories. For example, if you were in the original audience and somebody told you that story of the servant finding Rebekah, and you heard that servant tell this story over like 3 times, by the end of that story, you'd probably remember it pretty well. And also, the repetition in the story builds drama. It creates anticipation between the point A and the point B, between the beginning and the end. There's a journey to the story. The repetition builds the drama. It takes some time. So, in the story of Isaac and Rebekah's meeting, the original audience doesn't know. Will the servant be successful? Will Rebekah's father agree to this marriage? Will Rebekah agree to go with the servant? What will their meeting be like? So the storyteller takes his time going through the story. And so you make a little progress, and then you tell the beginning again. And then you make a little more progress, and you tell the beginning again. And the whole time, if you're in the original audience, you're thinking, like, what's going to happen? And so instead of just saying, well, Abraham sent his servant and they found Rebekah and now they're married, you get to build the drama and the excitement of the story. The repetition in the larger narrative also allows the writers to introduce variation. So, as we've said, we've seen the sister-wife story, my wife is my sister story, 3 times in Genesis so far. But always with a subtle, unexpected twist. So in the second telling of that story, second time it happens with Abraham and Sarah, we're surprised to find out that Abraham technically is telling the truth. Sarah's his half-sister. We heard the story once, it never came up. All of a sudden we hear the story again, Abraham does it the second time, and there's a little twist. We didn't know that. That's an exciting way to use the repetition. Use the story and you can throw in a new detail, a little twist. The listener thinks they know what's going to happen, but they don't know the whole story yet. We get this a little bit in the Isaac and Rebekah story as well. So we think we know how it's going to go. I mean, the leader's name's even the same, right? And so we think like, oh, well, we've seen this story before. Says that his wife is his sister. It gets him into all kinds of trouble, but then it's like a really happy ending. Well, what's different in this one is the king never takes Rebekah into his harem, unlike Sarah. That's a little different. And then the story says, and I think there's more to it than maybe what we're given, that they're laughing together in a husband and wife way. So, I don't know, there might be a certain way that husbands and wives laugh that you could see from a distance and be like, clearly that's not his sister, they're laughing like a husband and wife would laugh. I'm guessing the text is meant to be a little bit suggestive. Something's going on that's maybe making them feel happy, and the king notices and is like, wait a minute, that's not his sister. That's not his sister. Again, there's repetition, but there's also a new twist to the story. Keeps it fresh, keeps it interesting, but it sort of hooks you at the beginning, thinking like, oh, I've heard this before. Oh, okay. So we've seen that a lot. It seemed worth mentioning that we have this repetition. So we started talking tonight at the beginning. We talked about how dysfunctional the family dynamics have been in Genesis, including in the stories we've read this week. A lot of dysfunction. The early portion of the Jacob story is packed with deceit, but with a clear endgame. Jacob, from the moment of his birth, seems intent on usurping his brother's place as the oldest son. Right, we get that from the beginning of their story. It starts off with him coming out holding on to Esau's heel, which is a play on a word for a verb heel that this later used in the Old Testament to suggest overcoming or usurping someone's rights. And so from the very beginning of the story, we get this sense that something's going on here, even as babies. But the problem is, Jacob clearly cannot be the oldest son. He was born second. And that's pretty clear cut. You're born first or you're born second. He was born second. He can't be the oldest son. Pretty simple, right? Now, the hard piece of this is he was born just seconds after his oldest brother. And those seconds cost him basically a fortune. If he had just sort of jostled his way to the front of the line, totally different story. But he was born second, and he can't change that. But Jacob is stubborn. He believes in himself, I guess. So he thinks it's possible to take both Esau's birthright and his blessing, which were both due in that ancient world to the eldest son. He's not deterred by birth order. Now, what can be troubling, I think, to modern readers, especially maybe to those of us who are firstborn, like myself, some of you perhaps as well, is that the biblical writers seem to give no moral judgment against Jacob's scheming and his dishonesty in today's writings. I mean, he ends up being the hero of the story, right? So the whole people is named after him when he's given the name Israel. So there doesn't seem to be a moral judgment against the scheming and the deceit. I think that's a little troubling. I mean, we get to the end of the story, and Jacob is the one who is blessed. He goes on to be the namesake of his people. At one point, the narrator even justifies Jacob's scheming by suggesting that Esau despised his own birthright, which is basically a justification at the end of that story, where it's just like, well, Esau didn't want it anyway, so he's right to trick him out of it. Let's talk a little bit about birthright and blessing, because they play such a significant role in the stories that we had this week. So first, the birthright. The oldest son received a greater inheritance than the other children of the family. So part of our chapters this week, in chapter 25, we saw the end, basically, of Abraham's life. And in Abraham's story, the text is very clear, first, that Isaac was considered the eldest, even though he's not. But he was considered the oldest of the 8 sons. We know that Ishmael was, but he's not the child of promise. And so the text tells us that when Abraham died, all of his possessions upon his death went to Isaac. Now it says he gave some gifts to the other sons while he was living, but when he died, Isaac was the sole beneficiary of his father's will, so to speak. That's a pretty significant birthright. Now, that wasn't always the case, that it was everything. But it was the case that the oldest son received more than all the others. Probably, usually, at least twice as much. So this was significant. So you can see the predicament Jacob's in, at least how he feels about it. This isn't really fair. My older brother is going to get everything. Is going to get a lot more than me. He'll be wealthy. I will struggle. And it's only by a few seconds. So the next is the blessing. So that's the birthright. The birthright is about goods. The blessing is not. The blessing is something else. So we remember the story. Jacob schemes to take Esau's birthright. But the birthright was not enough for Jacob. So he already has the birthright. He's already getting the vast majority of the inheritance. But he also decides that he wants his father's blessing as well. He was not content with just the birthright. Now, let's be clear. The blessing was not intended to be like a magic spell. But in Genesis, it does seem to help define a child's destiny. Now, in part, that's going to be because the stories are, as we've already discussed many times in our Genesis study, they're origin stories. To a certain extent, the story of Isaac's blessing gives a background to the future relationships and political interactions of Israel and the Edomites, the descendants of Jacob, the descendants of Esau. And to a certain extent, it's looking back and saying, well, that dynamic played out that Israel was much more powerful and that Esau's descendants ended up serving Jacob's descendants. And so we do have a bit of an origin story here. But there's also more to this story in the importance of the blessing. And we can see that there's more to the blessing when we see how Esau reacts when he discovers what happened. So you remember the story. Rebekah decided to scheme with Jacob to take the blessing that Esau was supposed to offer to, Isaac was supposed to offer to Esau. Rebekah finds out it's going to happen, and she decides, well, this needs to be Jacob because I like him better. And so they go through this whole elaborate scheme. They strap him up with goat skin. They put on Esau's clothes. They make this goat stew that would taste maybe gamey or whatever, because he was looking for Esau to go hunt some animals and cook it for him. And Isaac's a little confused about the voice, but he smells like Esau, and he feels like Esau, and he cooks like Esau. And so Isaac offers his blessing to the wrong son. And Esau finds out, and we get this desperate, heartbreaking cry from Esau, where he is just begging, "Bless me too, Father. Haven't you saved a blessing for me? Don't you have more than one blessing?" It's a fascinating part that I think tells us something about the distinction between birthright and blessing. We've already seen the story about how Esau lost his birthright. He didn't seem to care that much. I mean, he just sort of walked away, right? Clearly in the text, Esau cares less about the material riches of the birthright than he does about his father's blessing. I mean, he gave up the birthright for some lentil soup, which is why we had it tonight. And don't forget the donation jars. When Jacob takes Isaac's blessing, it crushes Esau so much that he promises that as soon as Isaac dies, he's going to kill Jacob. See that distinction? It goes from, "Oh, I'm really hungry, I would give you my birthright, all these riches for a bowl of soup," but when he finds out that his father's blessing has been taken, which is no material wealth, he's devastated. And in some way, I think this then becomes a timeless story. Not just about Jacob and Esau. Not just about a formulaic blessing of the words that Isaac said, but about the tremendous importance of a parent's unconditional love and acceptance, which is essentially what the blessing was. Jacob and Esau grew up in a home defined by resentment, blatant favoritism, deceit. And in the end, it is a family in which only one child would be blessed, and the other would go unblessed. Right? In a sense, this rivalry between Jacob and Esau grows out of the idea that their parents were either unwilling or unable to love both of them. There doesn't seem to be enough love to go around. And because love was a limited resource, the family members hurt each other, they betray each other, they do whatever they can to get the little bit of love that was there. So Jacob's willing to do whatever he can to get his father's blessing. And Esau, when he realizes he didn't get it, he weeps bitterly and he begs for acceptance, for a blessing from his father. And when he finds out he can't really get it, he decides he's going to kill the brother that did get it. It meant a lot more than the stuff. And so I think what we get from this story is we are reminded that unconditional love and acceptance are the most essential gifts we can give our children. The foundation for all of the blessings we can offer them. We can offer them other stuff. I mean, Jacob was walking away. He had tons of stuff already. He was going to be inheritor of Isaac's possessions. And we see in the Bible that for a nomadic shepherd, Isaac was considered quite wealthy. And Jacob already got it. He already had that. But it still wasn't enough. We're going to have one more small group discussion. It's going to be a little different than the last one. So we see in today's text how desperately both sons longed for their parents' blessing. And so in your small groups, I ask you to discuss in what ways might we bless our children. And that could be your biological children, it could be your godchildren, it could be your nieces and nephews. In what ways might we bless our children? Okay. Go ahead. You're welcome to discuss. And thank you for joining us on Facebook tonight. I hope that you enjoyed our discussion of Isaac and Jacob and Esau and Rebekah. Next week, we're going to be discussing the Jacob story, which can be found in Genesis chapters 28 through 36. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great night.